Betty Mae Johnson's arthritis-gnarled fingers froze on the porch light switch, her breath catching as desperate whimpering pierced the Montana blizzard. 3 tiny German Shepherd puppies lay dying in the snow, their gray fur crystallized with ice, while their mother clawed frantically at the wooden door with bloodied paws. This wasn't abandonment, it was a plea for help. The coffee mug slipped from Betty's trembling hand, shattering against the floorboards as recognition struck her like lightning. The mother dog's left ear bore a faded military tattoo, numbers she'd seen on wounded soldiers 40 years ago in Da Nang field hospitals. Betty's mind flashed to Michael, her son's final letter from Afghanistan, mentioning a 4-legged angel named Liberty. The same dog now stood before her, amber eyes reflecting a mother's desperation that transcended species. "Dear God in heaven," Betty whispered, yanking open the door as Arctic winds slammed into her frail body. Outside, death stalked closer with each labored breath of the puppies. Inside, a choice waited that would shatter 3 lives forever. How long did they have before someone discovered what she was about to do? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Betty Mae Johnson had been a different woman. At 78, she'd survived 3 wars as a field nurse, buried a husband of 52 years, and said goodbye to her only son, Michael, in a flag-draped coffin from Afghanistan. The 2,400-acre ranch in Glacier County, Montana, had become her prison of memories, where silence stretched between sunrise and sunset like barbed wire across her soul. Every morning, she set 2 plates for breakfast out of habit. Every evening, she spoke to Harold's empty chair about the weather, the cattle prices, anything to fill the crushing quiet. The Veterans Administration checks kept coming, but money couldn't buy what she'd lost: purpose, family, the feeling that her life still mattered to someone. 30 miles south, Sarah Mitchell was drowning in a different kind of despair. The double-wide trailer she shared with 8-year-old Tommy sat like a rust-stained Band-Aid on 5 acres of scrubland, surrounded by medical bills that totaled $127,000. David's cancer had eaten through their savings faster than the disease consumed his body. Now, 3 jobs, diner waitress, overnight gas station clerk, weekend house cleaner, barely covered the mortgage payments that were already 2 months behind. Tommy hadn't spoken more than necessary since his father died. The boy who once chattered about dinosaurs and spaceships now communicated in shrugs and silence. His teachers called it selective mutism brought on by trauma. But Sarah knew it ran deeper. Tommy saw too much, understood too much, carried burdens no 8-year-old should bear. At Jefferson Elementary, kids whispered about his thrift store clothes and free lunch card. They called him weird because he preferred the company of the school's therapy dog to other children. Sarah watched her son retreat further into himself each day, knowing she couldn't afford the counseling he desperately needed. 40 miles north in Whitefish, Marcus Tank Henderson cleaned his service weapon with methodical precision. 23 years with Flathead County Animal Control had taught him that sentiment was a luxury small communities couldn't afford. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw served as a daily reminder, a pit bull's parting gift when he was 8 years old, 47 stitches that had sewn fear permanently into his DNA. His filing cabinet held 3,247 euthanization records. Each represented a potential tragedy prevented, a child who wouldn't suffer his fate. The law was clear. Aggressive animals posed unacceptable risks. Period. His daughter Rachel disagreed, but 17-year-olds lived in fairy tales where every stray could be saved and every ending was happy. Marcus kept a photo on his desk, himself at 8 before the attack, smiling without knowing that trust was a privilege some people couldn't afford. These days, he slept with a .38 under his pillow and checked the locks twice every night. Some people called him paranoid. He called it practical. None of them knew that within hours their separate worlds of grief, desperation, and fear would collide in Betty Mae Johnson's kitchen, forever changed by four desperate animals seeking shelter from a storm that was about to unleash more than just snow and wind. The blizzard struck Glacier County like God's own fury, transforming Highway 2 into a white-knuckle nightmare of swirling snow and black ice. Sarah Mitchell's 15-year-old Honda Civic shuddered with each gust of wind, its bald tires struggling for purchase on the increasingly treacherous asphalt. In the passenger seat, Tommy pressed his face against the frosted window, watching fence posts disappear into the storm like ghosts. "Mom, the engine's making that sound again," Tommy whispered, his first words in 2 hours. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The check engine light had been blinking for weeks, but the choice between car repairs and groceries wasn't really a choice at all. "We're almost to town, baby, just hold on." The Civic gave a mechanical wheeze, coughed twice, and died. They coasted to a stop on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing weakly into the wall of snow. Sarah turned the key repeatedly, hearing only the hollow click of a battery losing its fight against the cold. The heater died with the engine, and within minutes their breath began fogging in the rapidly cooling air. "Stay calm, Tommy. I'm going to call for help." Sarah's cell phone showed no signal, just the mocking words "emergency calls only" across a single bar that flickered and vanished. Through the passenger window, Tommy spotted a distant glow. Warm yellow light bleeding through the storm from what looked like a farmhouse maybe half a mile away. "There," he pointed. "Someone's home." Sarah stared into the howling darkness between them and that light. Montana winter didn't negotiate or offer second chances. They could freeze to death waiting for help that might never come, or risk the walk to a stranger's door. "Bundle up, sweetheart. We're going for a little hike." The wind hit them like a physical blow the moment they left the car. Snow stung their faces with tiny needles of ice, and Sarah had to grip Tommy's hand fiercely to keep from losing him in the whiteout. Each step was a battle against drifts that sometimes reached Tommy's waist. Sarah's waitress shoes, designed for linoleum floors and 12-hour shifts, offered no protection against the elements. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, they stumbled onto a gravel driveway. The ranch house emerged from the storm like salvation itself, a solid log structure with smoke curling from the chimney and light spilling from every window. But it was the sounds from the front porch that stopped Sarah cold. Desperate, high-pitched whimpering cut through the wind. 3 small shapes huddled against the front door, their dark fur crusted with ice and snow. German shepherd puppies, maybe 10 weeks old, barely alive and crying with the helpless sounds of creatures abandoned to die. A larger shadow paced frantically around them, their mother, a magnificent German shepherd whose amber eyes reflected the porch light with fierce intelligence. When she saw Sarah and Tommy approaching, she didn't growl or retreat. Instead, she looked directly at Sarah with an expression that transcended species boundaries. It was the look of one mother recognizing another, a silent plea that needed no translation. "Please help them," Tommy whispered, and Sarah realized her son had found his voice again. Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened. Betty Mae Johnson stood in the doorway, her silver hair wild from sleep, wearing a faded flannel nightgown and combat boots that had seen better decades. Her blue eyes, sharp as January frost, took in the scene. 2 strangers in the storm, 3 dying puppies, and a mother dog whose desperation radiated like heat from a fire. "Well, don't just stand there letting all my heat out," Betty said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders in field hospitals and expected them to be followed. "Get those babies inside before they freeze solid." Sarah hesitated. "Ma'am, we don't want to impose. Our car broke down." "Life's too short for politeness when folks are dying on your doorstep," Betty interrupted. "You can explain yourselves once everyone's breathing steady. Now move." Tommy was already on his knees beside the puppies, his small hands gently checking each one. The mother dog watched him intently but didn't interfere, somehow recognizing that this strange boy meant no harm. "This one's barely breathing," Tommy said, cradling the smallest puppy against his chest. "And look at her paws. They're bleeding." Betty's eyes fixed on the mother dog's left ear, where a faded tattoo was barely visible through the matted fur. Numbers and letters that meant something to someone who'd spent 40 years patching up soldiers. Her breath caught in recognition, but she pushed the thought away. Sometimes the mind saw what it needed to see. Inside, all of us, now. Betty's tone brooked no argument. "Storm's getting worse, and I've got hot coffee and warm blankets for anyone with sense enough to accept them." As they crossed the threshold into warmth and safety, none of them realized they'd just taken the first step into a story that would challenge everything they believed about loyalty, family, and what it meant to be human. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Glacier County, the storm having passed but leaving behind 3 feet of pristine snow that transformed the landscape into a deceptive winter postcard. Inside Betty's kitchen, the aroma of strong coffee and bacon competed with the earthy smell of wet dog fur and the antiseptic sting of hydrogen peroxide. The 3 German Shepherd puppies had survived the night, curled together in a nest of old quilts beside the wood-burning stove. Their mother, whom Tommy had quietly named Liberty after reading her faded ear tattoo, lay watchful nearby. Every few minutes she'd lift her head to count her babies, amber eyes never fully trusting the warmth and safety that surrounded them. Betty moved around her kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades making life-or-death decisions under pressure. She'd cleaned and bandaged Liberty's torn paw pads, administered subcutaneous fluids to the most dehydrated puppy, and fed them all with a bottle and goat's milk she kept for the ranch's orphaned calves. "You've done this before," Sarah observed, watching Betty examine the smallest puppy with practiced hands. "Field hospitals don't just treat humans, honey. Animals get caught in wars too." Betty's voice carried the weight of memories she rarely shared. "Saw more than my share of 4-legged casualties in Vietnam. Dogs, mostly. Some were scouts. Some were just trying to survive like the rest of us." Tommy sat cross-legged beside Liberty, slowly earning her trust with patient stillness and gentle words. The boy who'd barely spoken in months was now carrying on a one-sided conversation with a traumatized military dog, his voice soft but steady. "I know you're scared," he whispered to Liberty. "I was scared too when my dad died, but Miss Betty won't hurt your babies. She's good people." Liberty's ears pricked forward at his tone, and for the first time since arriving her tail gave a tentative wag. The peaceful morning shattered at exactly 8:47 a.m. when heavy boots stomped across the front porch, followed by 3 sharp raps on the door that carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Animal control! Open up!" Betty's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. Sarah's face went pale. Tommy instinctively moved closer to Liberty, who had risen to her feet with her hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in her chest. "Mrs. Johnson, we know you're in there. We've got reports of aggressive strays on your property." Betty set down her coffee with deliberate calm. "Sarah, take Tommy and the dogs to the back bedroom, close the door and don't come out till I say. I'm not leaving you to—" "Do it, now." The authority in Betty's voice brooked no argument. Sarah gathered Tommy and helped herd the dog family toward the rear of the house, Liberty's nails clicking anxiously on the hardwood floors. Betty opened the front door to find Marcus Henderson filling her doorframe, his bulk imposing even in the morning light. Behind him stood Deputy Jim Crawford, a good man who looked uncomfortable with whatever had brought them here. "Marcus," Betty said with the cool politeness reserved for unwelcome visitors. "Little early for social calls, don't you think?" Marcus's scarred face showed no humor. Mrs. Johnson, we received a report of dangerous animals on your property. German shepherds. Military breeds are unpredictable, especially strays. For everyone's safety, I need to inspect your home and grounds. You got a warrant for that inspection, Marcus? Don't need one for public safety emergencies. These dogs could be rabid, aggressive, or worse. His hand rested casually on the tranquilizer gun at his hip. I've seen what these animals can do to people, especially children. Betty noticed how Marcus's free hand unconsciously touched the scar running down his jaw. The whole county knew the story. 8-year-old Marcus mauled by a neighbor's pit bull, 47 stitches and a lifetime of fear that had calcified into zealotry. Marcus, honey, there's nothing dangerous here but your attitude. Now, if you'd like to come back with proper paperwork— Ma'am, I can hear them. Deputy Crawford stepped forward, his voice apologetic but firm. Dogs barking in the back of the house. Marcus says they've been reported as strays without proper vaccinations or licenses. That's a public health issue. Betty's mind raced. These weren't strays. Liberty's military tattoo proved she belonged to someone, somewhere. But explaining that would mean revealing details she wasn't ready to share, memories she'd spent 40 years trying to forget. Boys, I appreciate your concern, but those dogs aren't going anywhere until I say they are. Marcus's expression hardened. Mrs. Johnson, I've euthanized over 3,000 animals in my career. Every single one was put down to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that destroyed my face. You can cooperate, or I can get that warrant and come back with more officers. Your choice. From the back of the house came a sound that made everyone freeze. Tommy's voice, high and frightened. Liberty, no! Come back! A door slammed. Paws thundered down the hallway. Liberty burst into the front room like a gray missile, positioning herself directly between Marcus and the hallway that led to her puppies. Her lips pulled back in a snarl that exposed teeth designed by evolution to protect what mattered most. Marcus stepped backward, his hand moving to the tranquilizer gun. There. You see? Aggressive posture, territorial behavior. This animal is a clear and present danger. She's protecting her babies, Betty snapped. Any mother would do the same. Animals aren't mothers, Mrs. Johnson. They're predators with instincts. Nothing more. Tommy appeared in the hallway entrance, tears streaming down his face. She just wants to keep us safe. She's not mean. She's scared. Marcus looked at the boy, small, vulnerable, exactly the age Marcus had been when his world was destroyed by fangs and fury. Son, step away from that animal, right now. No. Tommy's voice was quiet but absolutely certain. Liberty won't hurt me. She knows I'm her friend. To everyone's amazement, Tommy walked slowly toward Liberty. The dog's snarl faded as the boy approached. When he placed his small hand on her head, her tail began to wag. Jesus Christ, Deputy Crawford whispered. Kid's got a gift. Marcus's face contorted with something between rage and terror. That's exactly what they said about the dog that nearly killed me. Oh, Rex is so gentle. Rex loves children, right up until Rex tried to tear my throat out. Liberty sensed the escalating tension. Her hackles rose again, but she remained perfectly still under Tommy's calming touch. Mrs. Johnson, Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet, you have 24 hours to surrender those animals for proper evaluation and quarantine. If you refuse, I'll be back with a warrant and backup officers, and if that dog so much as growls at me again, I'll put it down on the spot. Betty Mae Johnson had faced down Viet Cong snipers, held dying soldiers in her arms, and buried the 2 men she'd loved most in this world. She'd be damned if she'd be intimidated by a man whose fear had curdled into cruelty. Marcus Henderson, you come back here without proper cause, and I'll show you what aggressive really looks like. Now get off my property!" As the officers retreated to their vehicle, Betty realized the storm outside had been nothing compared to the one now brewing. In 24 hours, everything would change. The next 72 hours transformed Betty Mae Johnson's ranch into the epicenter of a small-town controversy that would have made front-page news if Glacier County had possessed anything resembling real journalism. Instead, the story spread through the community with the efficiency of gossip and the distortion of a children's telephone game. By Tuesday morning, 3 distinct camps had formed in the coffee shops and church halls of Whitefish. Team Marcus consisted primarily of parents with young children, led by Carol Brennan, whose 6-year-old daughter attended Jefferson Elementary with Tommy. "I don't care how sweet that boy thinks those dogs are," Carol declared to anyone who'd listen at the Red Lodge Diner. "Marcus Henderson has kept this community safe for 23 years. If he says those animals are dangerous, that's good enough for me." Her supporters nodded over their scrambled eggs and hash browns, recounting every news story they'd ever heard about dog attacks. The fact that none of these incidents had occurred in Flathead County didn't diminish their conviction that Marcus was all that stood between their families and a canine apocalypse. Team Betty drew support from an unlikely coalition of military veterans, animal lovers, and anyone who'd ever been on the receiving end of Marcus's overzealous enforcement. At its head stood Father Michael O'Brien from St. Matthew's Catholic Church, whose weekly sermons had begun incorporating pointed references to showing mercy to the least among us, be they human or beast. "That woman nursed my brother back to health in Da Nang," declared Roy Patterson, a Vietnam vet who'd driven over from Kalispell specifically to offer his support. If Betty Mae Johnson says those dogs deserve a chance, then by God, they deserve a chance. The third group, led by Mayor Jim Holbrook, desperately sought middle ground that would prevent their quiet community from tearing itself apart over what he privately considered a bunch of damn dogs. But even his diplomatic attempts at mediation were failing as positions hardened and rhetoric escalated. Meanwhile, inside the ranch house that had become Ground Zero, Sarah Mitchell was discovering family history that explained decades of unanswered questions. It started when she found Betty organizing old photographs in the kitchen, sorting through decades of memories with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. One black-and-white image stopped Sarah cold, a young woman in military fatigues holding an infant, both standing beside a man in an army uniform. "That's my Michael," Betty said softly, noticing Sarah's interest. "Took that picture the day before he deployed to his second tour in Afghanistan. That baby he's holding." She paused, studying Sarah's face with new intensity. That baby was Jennifer Lynn Mitchell, born February 14, 1967 in San Antonio, Texas, to an unwed Army nurse who couldn't provide the life she deserved. Sarah's hands began trembling. "My mother's name was Jennifer Lynn. She told me she was adopted, but she never knew. I was 19, scared, and in love with a soldier who died in Tet before he ever knew about the baby." Betty's voice carried 4 decades of regret. "The agency said they'd found a good Christian family in Montana. I made them promise never to tell me the details, thought it would be easier that way." The room fell silent, except for the soft snoring of puppies and the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Liberty, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, padded over to rest her head on Sarah's knee. "So you're my—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "Grandmother. I'm your grandmother, honey. And that makes Tommy my great-grandson." Betty's voice broke slightly. "I've been alone in this house for 3 years, praying for some sign that my life still had purpose. Then you show up in a blizzard with my great-grandson who's got the same gift with animals that Michael had." Tommy looked up from where he'd been teaching the puppies to sit. Does this mean we're family now? Sugar, we've been family since the day you were born. I just didn't know it yet. The emotional reunion was interrupted by the rumble of diesel engines in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, they watched Marcus Henderson climb out of an animal control truck, followed by Deputy Crawford and two officers Sarah didn't recognize. "He's early," Betty muttered, checking the wall clock. "Still got 18 hours left on his deadline." Marcus's boots thundered across the porch with military precision. His knock was sharp, official, and utterly without patience. "Mrs. Johnson, this is your final warning. Open the door." Betty exchanged glances with Sarah, then walked to the front door with the steady gait of someone who'd faced down worse threats than overzealous bureaucrats. "Marcus, you're trespassing. I told you to come back with proper paperwork." "I've got it." Marcus held up a manila folder, thick with official documents. Emergency seizure warrant signed by Judge Morrison, immediate quarantine order from the county health department, and authorization to use whatever force is necessary to ensure public safety. Behind him, the two unfamiliar officers shifted uncomfortably. They were from Missoula, Sarah realized, brought in specifically because they didn't have personal relationships that might complicate the situation. "Mrs. Johnson," Deputy Crawford said apologetically, "I'm sorry it's come to this, but we need you to surrender the animals peacefully." "Nobody wants anyone to get hurt. The only one talking about hurting anyone is Marcus," Betty replied. "Those dogs haven't shown aggression toward a single soul." Yet, Marcus's scarred face was stone. "Mrs. Johnson, I've studied canine behavior for over 20 years. I know the warning signs, and I'm seeing them in that shepherd: territorial behavior, protective instincts over resources, pack mentality. It's textbook pre-attack conditioning." From inside the house came Tommy's voice. "Liberty, stay. Good girl, stay." Marcus flinched at the sound. "There's a child in immediate danger. Officers, we're going in." "Wait." Sarah appeared in the doorway, having positioned herself strategically between the law enforcement team and her son. "Mr. Henderson, before you do something we'll all regret, there's something you need to know about these dogs." "Ma'am, with respect, nothing you can tell me will change the fact that—" "That dog's name is Liberty," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying across the frozen yard with crystalline clarity. "She's a military working dog, retired from active duty in Afghanistan. She served 3 tours, saved 23 American lives, and earned 2 commendations for valor under fire." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his hand moved away from his tranquilizer gun. "Moreover," Sarah continued, "she served alongside Army Specialist Michael Johnson, who died saving his unit from an IED blast outside Kandahar in 2019. Liberty was wounded in the same explosion. The Army retired her with full honors." "That's impossible," Marcus said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Military dogs don't just wander around Montana." Betty stepped forward, holding a weathered manila envelope. "Specialist Michael Johnson was my son, Marcus, and these are Liberty's service records delivered to my door by a very apologetic Army transport sergeant who lost her during a Colorado blizzard 3 weeks ago." She handed Marcus the documents with steady hands. "That dog you're so eager to kill, she's been protecting my great-grandson the same way she protected my son, the same way she protected 22 other soldiers who came home to their families because a 4-legged angel watched their backs." Marcus opened the folder with trembling fingers. His face went pale as he read Liberty's service record: deployment dates, mission reports, commendations, and a final medical evaluation detailing shrapnel wounds and PTSD symptoms that had ended her military career. "Jesus," Deputy Crawford whispered, reading over Marcus's shoulder. "She's a genuine war hero." One of the Missoula officers lowered his weapon entirely. "Sir, with respect, are we really going to euthanize a decorated veteran?" Marcus's world was tilting off its axis. For 23 years, his worldview had been binary, dangerous animals versus innocent humans. Now he held documentation proving that the dangerous animal he'd been so determined to destroy had saved more human lives than most people ever would. "This doesn't change anything," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trauma can make any animal unpredictable. Military training doesn't override basic instincts." "You're right," Tommy said, appearing beside his mother in the doorway. "Trauma does make you unpredictable. It made you hate all dogs because one hurt you when you were little. But Liberty's trauma taught her to protect people, not hurt them." The 8-year-old's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. "Son, you don't understand." "I understand that you're scared," Tommy continued with the brutal honesty only children possess. "I was scared too when Dad died. I was scared of everything. New people, new places, loud noises. But being scared doesn't mean everyone else has to be scared too." Marcus looked at this small boy who was fearlessly defending a military dog with more combat experience than most human veterans, and something fundamental shifted in his chest. The scar on his jaw began to throb, not with remembered pain, but with recognition of how that pain had shaped 34 years of decisions. "Mrs. Johnson," he said slowly, "I need to see these animals for myself. Professional evaluation. If they show any signs of aggression—" "They won't," Tommy said confidently. "Liberty knows the difference between good people and bad people. She knows you're just scared, not mean." Deputy Crawford cleared his throat. "Marcus, maybe we should call this in. Get some guidance from—" "No." Marcus's voice was harsh, but his hand was shaking as he closed Liberty's service jacket. "I'll make my own determination, but I evaluate them my way with my protocols. Everyone else stays back." Betty nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But Marcus, you hurt that dog and you'll answer to me. And I promise you, son, I'm a lot more dangerous than any German shepherd you'll ever meet." As the group prepared to enter the house that had become a battleground between fear and compassion, none of them realized they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of family. The tension in Betty's living room was thick enough to cut with a knife as Marcus Henderson stood frozen in the doorway, his scarred hand gripping the tranquilizer gun like a lifeline. Liberty lay beside the fireplace, her 3 puppies nursing peacefully while Tommy sat cross-legged nearby, reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of Where the Red Fern Grows. Marcus's professional training warred with what his eyes were telling him. Everything he'd learned about aggressive canine behavior suggested that a military dog with PTSD should be hypervigilant, reactive, potentially dangerous. Instead, he was watching a scene of domestic tranquility that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. "She's not what I expected," Marcus admitted quietly to Deputy Crawford, who stood beside him taking notes on an incident report he clearly didn't want to write. "What were you expecting?" Betty asked from her position in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed but expression more curious than hostile. Marcus touched his scar unconsciously. "Aggression, territorial behavior, warning signs." He paused, watching Tommy gently stroke Liberty's head while she allowed the 8-year-old to handle her puppies. "Military dogs are weapons, Mrs. Johnson. They're trained to attack, to kill if necessary. The fact that she's retired doesn't change her conditioning." "You're half right," Betty said, moving into the room with 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Marcus, who accepted it with surprise. "Military dogs are weapons, but they're also partners, protectors, family members. Liberty wasn't just trained to attack. She was trained to think, to make decisions, to distinguish between friend and enemy." Sarah emerged from the back bedroom where she'd been organizing Tommy's few belongings, having made the decision to stay at the ranch indefinitely. The revelation that Betty was her grandmother had shifted something fundamental in her world. Suddenly, the crushing isolation of single parenthood had transformed into the warm possibility of generational support. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said carefully, "may I ask you something personal?" Marcus stiffened but nodded. "How old were you when you were attacked?" 8. The word came out like a gunshot. "The same age as Tommy." Sarah sat down beside her son, who continued reading while absently petting Liberty's massive head. "Can you imagine Tommy hurting anyone? Can you picture him being aggressive or violent?" Marcus looked at the small boy who'd stood up to armed officers to protect a dog he'd known for less than 3 days. "No, but children aren't dogs." "Aren't they?" Tommy looked up from his book, his young voice carrying surprising wisdom. "My dad used to say that kids and dogs are a lot alike. We both need love and safety and someone to teach us right from wrong. The difference is, dogs figure out who to trust a lot faster than kids do." As if to prove his point, one of the puppies, a fat, sleepy male with distinctive white markings, wobbled away from his mother and tumbled directly into Marcus's boots. Instead of crying or retreating, the puppy immediately began trying to climb up Marcus's leg, tail wagging with the boundless optimism that only puppies possess. Marcus stepped back instinctively, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Get it away from me." "He's not attacking you," Tommy said patiently. "He's trying to play. That's what puppies do with people they like." The puppy, undeterred by Marcus's retreat, continued his assault on the animal control officer's shoelaces, growling playfully as he engaged in mortal combat with the perceived threats to his new friend's feet. Liberty watched the interaction with calm intelligence, making no move to intervene. Her body language spoke volumes to anyone trained to read canine behavior, ears forward but relaxed, tail at half-mast, eyes alert but not aggressive. She was monitoring the situation but felt no need to act. "She's evaluating you," Betty observed, following Marcus's gaze to the adult dog. "Trying to figure out if you're friend or foe. Military dogs are taught to read human body language, voice patterns, stress indicators. Right now, Liberty knows you're afraid, but she also knows you haven't made any truly threatening moves." Marcus knelt slowly, extending one trembling finger toward the puppy who was now completely entangled in his bootlaces. The moment his skin made contact with soft fur, something shifted in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for 34 years. The puppy immediately abandoned the shoelaces in favor of this new and fascinating human appendage, gently mouthing Marcus's finger with needle-sharp teeth that could have drawn blood but didn't. "He's got good bite inhibition," Marcus said automatically, his professional knowledge overriding his fear. "Mother's taught him not to bite hard." "Liberty's a good mama," Tommy agreed. "She teaches them stuff all day long. Watch this." He stood up and walked toward the front door. "Liberty, guard." The dog immediately rose to her feet, positioning herself between Tommy and the door. Her demeanor shifted subtly, still calm, but now clearly alert and ready for action. "Liberty, friend," Tommy said, pointing to Marcus. "Friend." Liberty's ears flicked toward Marcus, then back to Tommy. She tilted her head, processing the command, then walked slowly toward Marcus. When she reached him, she sat down and extended one massive paw. Marcus stared at the offered paw for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile this gesture with decades of ingrained fear. "She's shaking hands?" "It's how she says hello to people Tommy tells her are okay," Sarah explained. "She's been doing it since the first night. I think it's something she learned in the service." Tentatively, Marcus reached out and grasped Liberty's paw. Her amber eyes met his directly, and in that moment of contact, something passed between them. Recognition of shared trauma, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they'd both spent years being afraid of the wrong things. "Well, I'll be damned," Deputy Crawford muttered, watching his longtime colleague shake hands with the dog he'd been prepared to euthanize an hour earlier. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of vehicles in the driveway, multiple engines, slamming doors, raised voices. Through the window, Betty could see at least 6 trucks and SUVs, including a news van from KPX out of Missoula. "What the hell?" Marcus stood quickly, his hand automatically moving to his radio. The front door burst open without warning, admitting a crowd of people that filled Betty's living room to capacity. Carol Brennan led the charge, flanked by a half-dozen parents from Jefferson Elementary. Behind them came Father O'Brien, Roy Patterson, and what looked like half the congregation of St. Matthew's Catholic Church. "Where is it?" Carol demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "Where's the dangerous dog?" Liberty rose immediately, positioning herself between the crowd and the puppies. Her hackles were up, but she made no aggressive moves, simply stood ready, waiting for direction from her pack leaders. "Carol, what the hell do you think you're doing barging into my home?" Betty's voice could have frozen fire. "Protecting our children." Carol's eyes were wild, fixed on Liberty with the kind of fear that made rational conversation impossible. "That animal is going to kill someone, and we're not going to wait around for it to happen." "Mrs. Brennan," Marcus said, stepping forward with an authority that surprised everyone, including himself. "I need you and your group to leave immediately. This is an active investigation." "Investigation?" Roy Patterson pushed forward, his veteran's bearing evident in every step. "Marcus, you can't be serious about harming this animal. She's a decorated war hero." "War hero or not, she's still a predator," Carol shot back. "I don't care what she did overseas. I care about what she might do to our children." The room erupted in arguments. Parents shouted about safety and responsibility, while veterans countered with stories of military dogs who'd saved human lives. Church members quoted Bible verses about compassion, while others cited statistics about dog attacks. The noise level rose until it was overwhelming, chaotic, frightening. And in the center of it all sat Tommy Mitchell, 8 years old and completely calm, with his hand resting on Liberty's head while she trembled with the effort of not reacting to the chaos surrounding her. "Enough!" Betty's voice cut through the din like a cavalry charge. Every person in the room fell silent, struck by the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Get out," she said quietly. "All of you. Right now. This is my home. And you're frightening the animals." "Mrs. Johnson," Father O'Brien said apologetically, "we only wanted to help." "Then help by leaving. Marcus has official business here. The rest of you are trespassing." As the crowd reluctantly began to file toward the door, Carol Brennan made one last desperate play. "You're all making a terrible mistake. When that dog attacks someone, and it will, their blood will be on your hands." She pointed dramatically at Liberty, who was still standing protectively near Tommy. "Look at it. Look at those eyes. That's not a pet. That's a killer waiting for its chance." Tommy stood up slowly, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mrs. Brennan, Liberty isn't waiting to hurt anyone. She's waiting for someone to tell her it's okay to relax. She's scared because you're all yelling and acting crazy. But she won't bite anyone unless they try to hurt me or her babies. That's what good dogs do. They protect their families." Carol's face flushed red. "Don't you dare lecture me, you little—" "Ma'am." Marcus's voice was steel wrapped in ice. "Threatening a child in my presence is a very poor decision. I suggest you leave now, before I decide this situation requires additional charges." As Carol stormed out, dragging her supporters behind her, the room felt suddenly enormous and empty. Liberty slowly lowered herself back to the floor, but her eyes remained alert, watching the door through which trouble had entered and might return. "Well," Deputy Crawford said finally, "that could have gone better." Marcus holstered his tranquilizer gun and looked around the room, at Betty, whose fierce protectiveness reminded him of his own grandmother, at Sarah, whose quiet strength spoke of battles fought and won, at Tommy, whose fearless love for a traumatized animal was teaching them all about courage, and at Liberty, whose amber eyes held depths of loyalty and sacrifice that humbled him. "Mrs. Johnson," he said formally, "after my evaluation, I'm ruling that these animals pose no threat to public safety. They can remain in your custody indefinitely." Tommy's face lit up with joy, but before he could celebrate, Marcus held up a hand. "However," he continued, "there are conditions. All animals must be properly licensed and vaccinated. Any signs of aggressive behavior must be reported immediately. And Mrs. Johnson," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "if anything happens, anything at all, I'll be held responsible. My career, my reputation, possibly criminal charges, you understand what I'm risking here?" Betty Mae Johnson, who'd spent her life making calculated risks in impossible situations, nodded gravely. "Son, I understand exactly what you're risking. The question is, do you understand what you're saving?" Marcus looked at Tommy, who had returned to his position beside Liberty, reading aloud while 3 puppies used him as a jungle gym. For the first time in 34 years, Marcus Henderson allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, not all dogs were monsters waiting to strike. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again. But inside Betty's ranch house, something warmer than weather was beginning to bloom. The fragile peace that had settled over Betty's ranch lasted exactly 11 days. On a crisp Thursday morning in late March, as the last stubborn patches of snow were surrendering to an early Montana spring, everything went catastrophically wrong. Tommy had developed a routine with Liberty and her puppies that filled the hollow spaces in his heart left by his father's death. Every morning at 7, he'd slip out of bed and pad barefoot to the living room where the dogs slept. Liberty would greet him with a gentle nose bump and a tail wag that had become the most reliable source of joy in his young life. The 3 puppies, now named Scout, Ranger, and Bear by Tommy's methodical 8-year-old logic, had grown into rambunctious balls of fur and mischief. They were large enough to cause minor household disasters, but still small enough to sleep in a pile like oversized hamsters. That Thursday morning, Tommy made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I want to show Mrs. Brennan that Liberty is good," he announced to Sarah over breakfast, his bowl of cereal growing soggy as he gestured excitedly. "If she meets Liberty properly, she'll see that we're telling the truth." Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "Tommy, honey, Mrs. Brennan doesn't want to meet Liberty. Some people just can't change their minds, no matter what you show them." "But she has to," Tommy insisted with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Liberty saved soldiers. She's a hero. If I can just prove it." Betty, who'd been listening from the kitchen sink, turned around with an expression of gentle concern. "Sugar, your mama's right. Some folks are too afraid of their own shadows to see the light. Carol Brennan is one of those folks." Tommy's face scrunched with frustration. "That's not fair. Liberty doesn't deserve people being scared of her when she never did anything wrong." The adults exchanged glances over his head. "How do you explain to an 8-year-old that fairness is a luxury the world rarely provides?" After Sarah left for her morning shift at the diner and Betty headed out to check on the cattle, Tommy made his choice. He clipped Liberty's leash, a sturdy leather lead that Marcus had provided as part of the licensing requirements, to her collar, and headed toward town with the determined stride of someone on a mission of mercy. Liberty followed willingly, her military training making her an ideal walking companion. She stayed precisely at Tommy's left side, automatically stopping at curbs and adjusting her pace to match his shorter legs. To anyone watching, they looked like a boy and his well-trained dog taking a pleasant morning stroll. Tommy's destination was the Jefferson Elementary playground, where he knew Carol Brennan volunteered as a crossing guard during morning drop-off. His plan was simple: demonstrate Liberty's obedience, show off her tricks, prove once and for all that she was safe around children. He never considered that good intentions could lead to catastrophic consequences. Carol Brennan spotted them from 2 blocks away. Her sharp eyes, constantly scanning for potential threats to her children, identified the massive German Shepherd before she recognized the small boy holding the leash. Every nightmare she'd harbored for the past 2 weeks crystallized into a single moment of pure terror. "Oh my God," she whispered, then screamed at the top of her lungs, "Dangerous dog! Everyone get inside!" The playground, which moments before had been filled with the cheerful chaos of children waiting for the first bell, erupted in panic. Kids scattered in every direction, some running toward the school building, others freezing in place with the deer-in-headlights paralysis that trauma creates. Liberty's military training kicked in automatically. Suddenly, surrounded by screaming, running figures, her PTSD-conditioned brain interpreted the chaos as a combat situation. Her hackles rose, her ears pinned back, and she placed herself protectively between Tommy and the perceived threats. "Liberty, no!" Tommy cried, but his young voice was lost in the pandemonium. Carol Brennan grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "Emergency! There's a vicious dog attacking children at Jefferson Elementary. Send everyone!" Within minutes, the quiet school zone transformed into a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and Marcus Henderson's animal control truck converged from multiple directions, sirens wailing and lights flashing. The local news van that had been covering a mundane city council meeting suddenly had a breaking story. Tommy stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his face, trying desperately to calm Liberty, while adults shouted orders and children screamed in the distance. Liberty, confused and overwhelmed, began exhibiting the aggressive postures that her PTSD had been suppressed but never eliminated. She barked, deep, commanding sounds that carried the authority of a military working dog asserting control over a chaotic situation. To the panicked observers, these weren't the barks of a confused animal trying to protect her boy. They were the sounds of a dangerous predator preparing to attack. Marcus Henderson arrived to find his worst nightmare made manifest. The dog he'd reluctantly agreed to spare was now displaying exactly the aggressive behaviors he'd spent his career preventing. "Tommy, step away from the dog," Marcus shouted through his truck's PA system. "Move slowly toward the school building." "She's not bad," Tommy screamed back, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's just scared. Everyone stop yelling." But it was too late. The situation had its own momentum now, fed by fear and adrenaline and the mob mentality that turns rational people into dangerous crowds. Principal Janet Morrison made the call that sealed Liberty's fate. "This is a code red lockdown situation. All children inside immediately." The lockdown alarm began blaring, a harsh electronic wail that sent Liberty's already frayed nerves completely over the edge. The sound triggered flashbacks to mortar attacks in Afghanistan, to the explosion that had killed her human partner and left her with psychological scars that even the best military veterinarians couldn't fully heal. Liberty lunged, not at the children, not at the adults, not at any human being. She lunged at the speaker mounted on the school's exterior wall, trying to silence the sound that was causing her psychological torment. But to Carol Brennan, to the panicked parents, to the arriving police officers who saw only a large German shepherd launching herself through the air with bared teeth, it looked like an attack. Marcus Henderson made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He raised his tranquilizer gun and fired. The dart hit Liberty in mid-leap, its sedative payload designed for animals half her size because Marcus had been carrying equipment meant for small strays, not military-trained German shepherds. She crashed into the speaker, yelped once, and collapsed to the asphalt. Tommy's scream of anguish pierced through the chaos like a knife. "You killed her! You killed her!" He threw himself across Liberty's motionless body, sobbing with the kind of grief that adults spend lifetimes learning to suppress. The 8-year-old boy who'd found his voice through loving a traumatized animal was now experiencing trauma that would reshape his understanding of the world forever. Marcus holstered his weapon with hands that shook like autumn leaves. He'd made the right call according to every protocol he'd ever learned, but watching Tommy cradle the unconscious dog felt like the worst mistake of his life. "She's not dead," he called out, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarm. "She's sedated. She's going to be okay." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew they weren't true. The political fallout from this incident would be swift and merciless. Carol Brennan was already on her phone with the mayor, the school board, probably the governor for all he knew. The dog that had been given a second chance had just used it up in the most public way possible. By the time Sarah arrived, having heard the news on the diner's radio, Liberty was already loaded into the animal control truck. Tommy sat in the back of an ambulance, not because he was injured, but because the EMTs didn't know what else to do with a child experiencing that level of emotional breakdown. Betty Mae Johnson arrived last, driving her ancient pickup truck with the kind of reckless urgency reserved for true emergencies. She took one look at the scene, the flashing lights, the news cameras, the crowd of angry parents, and her great-grandson's tear-stained face, and knew that the peaceful interlude in their lives was over. The war for Liberty's life was about to begin in earnest, and this time Marcus Henderson would be fighting on the side of those who wanted her dead. The Flathead County Animal Control Facility had never been designed to house a celebrity prisoner, but that's exactly what Liberty had become in the 48 hours following the Jefferson Elementary incident. News vans lined the chain-link fence surrounding the concrete building, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Inside the facility's medical wing, Liberty lay in a reinforced kennel, her amber eyes dull with sedatives and confusion. The tranquilizer that had brought her down at the school had been followed by a steady regimen of anxiolytics designed to keep her calm while the legal machinery ground toward its inevitable conclusion. Marcus Henderson sat in his office, staring at the euthanization order that had arrived via certified mail that morning. Judge Morrison's signature was a black slash across Liberty's death warrant, scheduled for execution in 72 hours unless a legal miracle intervened. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 23 years of putting down animals without a second thought, Marcus was now facing the prospect of killing the one dog he'd begun to believe might be different, the same dog that had shaken his hand. The same dog whose puppies had played with his shoelaces while he knelt on Betty Johnson's living room floor, remembering what it felt like to not be afraid. His phone buzzed with another call from Mayor Holbrook, the 15th since yesterday. Marcus let it go to voicemail, knowing it would contain the same message as the previous 14. "Handle this quietly, Marcus. The town needs to see that we take public safety seriously. No exceptions, not even for war heroes." A knock on his office door interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Rachel Henderson entered, carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of righteous indignation that only 17-year-olds could perfect. Marcus's daughter had inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that had made their relationship complicated since the divorce 5 years earlier. "Dad, we need to talk." "If this is about the dog, Rachel, I don't want to hear it. The decision's been made." "By you?" Rachel slammed the folder onto his desk with enough force to scatter his paperwork. Or by the mob of scared parents who can't tell the difference between a trained military working dog and a rabid stray? Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. Rachel had her mother's dark hair and sharp features, but her eyes held something that reminded him uncomfortably of himself at her age. Absolute certainty that the world was divided into clear rights and wrongs. The dog displayed aggressive behavior in front of 30 children. That's not opinion, Rachel. That's documented fact. She was protecting Tommy from what she perceived as threats. That's also documented fact. Rachel opened the folder and began pulling out printed pages. I've spent the last 2 days researching canine PTSD, Dad. Do you know what triggers episodes in military working dogs? Marcus didn't answer, but his hand unconsciously moved to touch his scar. Loud noises, crowds, chaotic situations, exactly what happened at the school. Rachel continued pulling out documents, veterinary reports, military training manuals, academic studies. Liberty wasn't attacking anyone. She was having a panic attack, just like soldiers do when their PTSD gets triggered. It doesn't matter what caused it, Rachel. What matters is that she's dangerous. Like you were dangerous when you came home from Iraq? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Rachel had been 12 when he'd returned from his deployment, old enough to remember the nightmares, the angry outbursts, the months of therapy that had slowly rebuilt his ability to function in civilian life. That's different. How? Rachel's voice carried the uncompromising logic of youth. You had PTSD. You scared me sometimes when you'd wake up screaming, or when loud noises made you hit the floor. Should someone have put you down because you were potentially dangerous? Marcus stood up abruptly, turning away from his daughter's accusing stare. Through his office window he could see the kennels where Liberty waited for her execution, surrounded by the mundane strays and surrenders that filled his facility every week. I never hurt anyone, Rachel. Neither did Liberty. She destroyed a speaker, Dad. She attacked an inanimate object that was making sounds that triggered her trauma response. The only living thing she hurt was herself when she crashed into the wall. Rachel moved to stand beside her father at the window. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more daughter than activist. Dad, do you remember what you told me when I was little? After that nightmare I had about monsters in my closet? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering a 6-year-old Rachel sobbing in his arms at 2 in the morning. I told you that monsters weren't real, that the scary things in your head couldn't hurt you if you didn't let them. But you let them, didn't you? You let one dog attack when you were 8 years old turn into a lifetime of being afraid of all dogs. You let the monster in your head make decisions for you. The silence stretched between them, filled with 23 years of unexamined fears and the weight of thousands of animals that had died because of those fears. What do you want me to do, Rachel? The order's been signed. Even if I wanted to change my mind, you can appeal it. Request a formal behavioral evaluation by an independent veterinary psychologist. Argue for rehabilitation instead of execution. Rachel pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Montana State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Jennifer Walsh is one of the country's leading experts on canine PTSD. She's agreed to evaluate Liberty pro bono if we can get a stay of execution. Marcus stared at the letter, feeling the foundations of his worldview shifting beneath his feet. For more than 2 decades, his job had been simple. Dangerous animals got put down, end of story. Now his daughter was asking him to consider that maybe, just maybe, dangerous was a matter of circumstance rather than character. Even if Dr. Walsh could help Liberty, the public won't accept it. Carol Brennan's got half the county convinced that keeping this dog alive is tantamount to child endangerment. Then we show them they're wrong. Rachel's voice carried a determination that reminded Marcus why he'd been both proud of and intimidated by his daughter since she was old enough to form complete sentences. "Dad, you've spent your entire career being the guy who makes the hard choices so other people don't have to. But what if, just once, you were the guy who fought for second chances instead of final solutions?" Before Marcus could respond, his office phone rang. The caller ID showed Betty Johnson's number. "Henderson." "Marcus, it's Betty. I'm calling to ask you for the biggest favor of your life." Marcus glanced at Rachel, who was listening intently. "Mrs. Johnson, if this is about the dog, it's about my great-grandson. Tommy hasn't spoken a word since the school incident. Won't eat, won't sleep, just sits by the window staring at your facility. Sarah's beside herself, and I'm watching an 8-year-old boy die inside because he thinks he killed the only thing that made him feel safe in this world." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He'd been so focused on the legal and political ramifications of the incident that he'd barely considered its impact on the child at the center of it all. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand you're upset, but the decision has been made by scared people who don't know the difference between justice and revenge," Betty interrupted. "Marcus, I'm going to tell you something I've never told another living soul. In Vietnam, I had to make a choice between saving a wounded American soldier and a North Vietnamese fighter who'd been brought to our field hospital. Both were dying. I only had enough blood and morphine for one." The line went quiet, except for the sound of Betty's breathing. "I chose the American boy. Watched that Vietnamese kid die on a stretcher 6 feet away while I pumped blood into someone who looked like my little brother back home in Montana. That Vietnamese soldier wasn't much older than you are now, Marcus. He had pictures of his family in his pocket, letters from his mother." Marcus found himself holding his breath. "For 40 years I told myself I made the right choice. American versus enemy, us versus them. But you know what I learned when I got older and maybe a little wiser? They were both just scared boys who got caught up in something bigger than themselves, and I let fear and prejudice make a decision that I've regretted every day since." Betty's voice grew stronger, more urgent. "That dog in your kennel isn't a monster, Marcus. She's a scared soldier who got triggered by sounds and chaos that reminded her of the worst day of her life. Just like you were a scared boy who got attacked by an animal that should have been someone's responsibility to control. Don't let your 8-year-old trauma destroy another innocent life. Don't make the same mistake I made 40 years ago." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision he'd made in 23 years of animal control. How many dogs like Liberty had he put down without question? How many second chances had he denied because he was too afraid to examine his own motivations? "Mrs. Johnson, even if I wanted to help—" "You do want to help. I can hear it in your voice. The question is whether you're brave enough to do it." Rachel was watching her father with an expression of desperate hope. Outside his window, protesters had gathered on both sides of the street, Team Save Liberty facing off against Team Public Safety, their competing chants creating a cacophony of democracy in action. Marcus made his decision. "Mrs. Johnson, I need you to get me the best lawyer in Montana. Someone who specializes in animal law and isn't afraid of a fight." Rachel's face lit up like Christmas morning. "I'll also need character witnesses, expert testimony, and a full veterinary workup showing Liberty's psychological condition. Can you arrange that?" "Son," Betty said, her voice thick with emotion, "I can arrange whatever you need. But Marcus, once we start this fight, there's no going back. Half the county's going to call you a traitor to public safety. Your career might not survive it." Marcus looked at the euthanization order on his desk, then at his daughter, then out at the crowd of people whose children he'd sworn to protect. For the first time in decades, he felt like the person he'd been before an 8-year-old's trauma had defined the rest of his life. "Mrs. Johnson, some things are more important than careers. Let's save this dog." The courtroom of Judge Patricia Morrison was standing room only on the morning Liberty's fate would be decided. The emergency hearing had drawn spectators from across Flathead County and beyond, transforming what should have been a routine animal control proceeding into a media circus that would be remembered for decades. Betty Mae Johnson sat in the front row, her weathered hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Beside her, Sarah held Tommy, who hadn't spoken since the school incident 3 weeks earlier. The boy's silence had become a weight that pressed down on everyone who loved him, a constant reminder of how badly things had gone wrong. Behind them, the courtroom divided into familiar camps. Father O'Brien led a contingent of St. Matthew's parishioners, their presence a quiet statement about mercy and second chances. Roy Patterson and his fellow veterans occupied an entire section, some wearing their old service uniforms in solidarity with a four-legged comrade who'd served her country with honor. On the opposite side, Carol Brennan sat surrounded by concerned parents, their faces set in the grim expressions of people convinced they were fighting for their children's lives. The Jefferson Elementary PTA had taken out a full-page ad in the Whitefish Pilot, featuring photos of their children alongside the headline, "Who Will You Choose?" At the defendant's table, Marcus Henderson sat beside Elena Vasquez, the Billings attorney who'd agreed to take Liberty's case pro bono after Betty had made 6 frantic phone calls. Vasquez specialized in animal law and had a reputation for fighting impossible cases with the tenacity of a pit bull, an irony that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Judge Morrison called the court to order, her stern gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. At 62, Patricia Morrison had seen every kind of case Montana could produce, but nothing quite like this one. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a public forum. Any outbursts will result in immediate removal from my courtroom. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years making hard decisions. We are here to determine whether the German Shepherd known as Liberty poses a clear and present danger to public safety, warranting her immediate euthanization under Montana Code 87-3224. County Attorney David Walsh, no relation to the veterinary psychologist who would testify later, stood to present the state's case. He was a thin, nervous man who clearly wished he was anywhere else, but elections had consequences, and being seen as soft on public safety wasn't politically survivable. Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. On March 15th, the defendant animal displayed aggressive behavior in a public setting, specifically a school zone filled with children. She barked threateningly, assumed attack postures, and ultimately lunged toward a group of innocent bystanders. Under our laws, such behavior constitutes grounds for immediate euthanization. Walsh called Carol Brennan as his first witness. She took the stand wearing her best church dress and an expression of righteous determination. Mrs. Brennan, in your own words, please describe what you witnessed at Jefferson Elementary. Carol's voice shook with remembered terror. I saw a massive German Shepherd attacking innocent children. It was snarling, barking, showing its teeth. I've never been so frightened in my life. If that boy hadn't been holding the leash, I truly believe that animal would have killed someone. Thank you. No further questions. Elena Vasquez rose for cross-examination, her small frame belying the steel in her voice. Mrs. Brennan, you said the dog was attacking innocent children. How many children were actually bitten? Well, none, but how many children did Liberty make physical contact with? Carol shifted uncomfortably. None that I saw, but she would have if... Mrs. Brennan, yes or no? Did Liberty harm any person at Jefferson Elementary that day? A long pause. No, but... No further questions. The testimony continued for 2 hours. Principal Morrison described the chaos and her decision to initiate lockdown procedures. Several parents recounted their terror at seeing their children scatter in panic. Dr. Robert Chen, the emergency veterinarian who'd treated Liberty after the tranquilization, testified about her physical condition and the stress indicators he'd observed. Then Elena Vasquez began presenting Liberty's defense. Her first witness was Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Montana State University, whose expertise in canine PTSD had been established through decades of research and practical application. Dr. Walsh, based on your examination of Liberty and her service records, what is your professional opinion regarding her behavior at Jefferson Elementary? Dr. Walsh consulted her notes before answering. Liberty exhibited classic symptoms of a PTSD episode triggered by environmental stressors. The combination of crowd noise, children's screams, and particularly the lockdown alarm created a perfect storm of triggers for her trauma response. Her actions were defensive, not aggressive. Can you explain the difference? Aggressive behavior is predatory. A dog hunting or attacking for dominance or territorial reasons. Defensive behavior is reactive, an animal trying to protect itself or its pack from perceived threats. Liberty's military training taught her to neutralize threats to her unit's safety. When she heard the alarm system, her conditioned response was to eliminate the source of danger. The speaker on the school wall. Exactly! She attacked an inanimate object, not a person. This is actually evidence of her training and discipline, not a lack of control. Vasquez then called Marcus Henderson to the stand, a move that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Mr. Henderson, you've worked in animal control for 23 years. In your professional opinion, is Liberty a dangerous animal? Marcus looked out at the packed courtroom, his eyes finding his daughter Rachel in the crowd. Her encouraging nod gave him the strength to speak truth instead of fear. No, counselor. Liberty is a traumatized veteran who had a bad day. In 23 years of this job, I've learned to tell the difference between mean dogs and scared dogs. Liberty is scared, not mean. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Carol Brennan's face went ashen. What changed your mind, Mr. Henderson? Marcus's hand unconsciously moved to his scar. I realized that I'd been making decisions based on my own trauma instead of professional judgment. That's not fair to the animals, and it's not fair to the community I serve. The final witness was Betty Mae Johnson herself. At 78, she commanded the courtroom with the presence of someone who'd spent decades making life and death decisions under pressure. Mrs. Johnson, you've had extensive experience with both human and animal trauma. What is your assessment of Liberty's character? Betty's voice was steady and sure. Your Honor, I've known heroes and I've known villains. Liberty is a hero who's been broken by war. Just like too many of our human soldiers, she deserves the same chance at healing that we give our wounded veterans. She paused, looking directly at Tommy, who was watching her with the first spark of hope she'd seen in his eyes for weeks. Most importantly, Liberty saved my great-grandson's spirit. Tommy hasn't spoken since the school incident because he thinks he's responsible for her suffering. If we execute Liberty for having PTSD, we're telling every veteran, human or canine, that trauma is a death sentence instead of a treatable condition. As closing arguments concluded, Judge Morrison announced she would render her decision after a brief recess. The courtroom emptied into the hallway, where supporters of both sides waited in tense silence for a verdict that would determine not just Liberty's fate, but the kind of community Glacier County wanted to be. Judge Patricia Morrison returned to her bench after a 20-minute recess that felt like 20 hours to everyone waiting in the packed courtroom. Her face revealed nothing as she shuffled through the legal documents that would determine Liberty's fate, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the weight of the decision before her. In the matter of Flathead County versus the German Shepherd designated as Liberty, this court has carefully considered all testimony and evidence presented. Her voice carried across the silent courtroom with the gravity of Solomon preparing to divide the baby. Tommy Mitchell sat perfectly still in his mother's arms, his 8-year-old face pale but alert. For 3 weeks he'd carried the crushing weight of believing his decision to bring Liberty to school had sealed her death warrant. Now, as the judge prepared to speak, he held his breath along with everyone else in the room. The law is clear regarding animals that pose a threat to public safety. However, the law must be applied with both wisdom and compassion, particularly when dealing with creatures who have served our nation with distinction. Judge Morrison's eyes found Marcus Henderson in the crowd. "Mr. Henderson, your testimony was particularly compelling given your professional expertise and personal evolution regarding this case." Marcus straightened in his seat, feeling the weight of 23 years of decisions he could never undo. This court finds that while Liberty did exhibit behaviors that could be interpreted as threatening, the evidence clearly demonstrates these behaviors were the result of post-traumatic stress disorder, not inherent aggression or malicious intent. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Dr. Walsh's expert testimony regarding canine PTSD was thorough and convincing. Liberty's military service record speaks to her character and training. Betty Mae Johnson felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. However, Judge Morrison continued, and the word fell like a hammer on an anvil, this court cannot ignore the legitimate concerns of parents regarding their children's safety. Therefore, Liberty's continued existence in this community must be contingent upon strict conditions that protect both her well-being and public safety. Carol Brennan's face crumpled with disappointment, while across the aisle veterans and animal lovers held their breath. Liberty shall be remanded to the custody of Mrs. Betty Mae Johnson with the following conditions. First, she must undergo 6 months of intensive rehabilitation therapy with Dr. Walsh at Montana State University. Second, she must be accompanied by a qualified handler at all times when in public spaces. Third, any violation of these conditions will result in immediate reevaluation of this court's decision. The gavel fell with the finality of fate itself. Liberty is hereby granted a supervised reprieve. Court dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Cheers from Liberty supporters mixed with angry shouts from parents who felt their children had been sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. Tommy Mitchell spoke his first words in 3 weeks. "We won, Mama, we won." Sarah burst into tears, holding her son close while Betty Mae Johnson felt 78 years of accumulated pain begin to transform into something that felt remarkably like joy. But the real transformation was happening in Marcus Henderson, who sat motionless as people filed past him, some offering congratulations for his courage, others shooting accusatory glares for his perceived betrayal. Rachel appeared at his side, wrapping her arms around her father in a hug that bridged years of complicated relationship. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Marcus held his daughter close, realizing that for the first time in decades, he was proud of himself too. 6 months later, Thanksgiving Day. The kitchen of Betty Mae Johnson's ranch house overflowed with the controlled chaos of a family preparing for their first holiday together in generations. Sarah stirred gravy while Betty basted the turkey, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd been rehearsing together for years instead of months. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, carefully arranging place cards with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered. Liberty lay beside the fireplace, her 3 grown puppies sprawled around her in various states of dignified repose. The intensive therapy with Dr. Walsh had worked miracles, not by erasing her trauma, but by teaching her coping mechanisms that allowed her to live with it. She wore a special vest that identified her as a therapy dog in training, her new purpose giving meaning to old pain. The puppies, Scout, Ranger, and Bear, had grown into magnificent animals, each finding homes with families who understood their unique heritage. Scout lived with Father O'Brien at the church, providing comfort to parishioners in crisis. Ranger had been adopted by Roy Patterson, becoming a companion for the old veteran who'd discovered that healing trauma sometimes required sharing it with another wounded soul. Bear, the fattest and most sociable of the three, had found his calling as a therapy dog at the Kalispell Veterans Administration Hospital. A knock at the door interrupted Betty's memories. She opened it to find Marcus Henderson standing on her porch, holding a bottle of wine and wearing the awkward expression of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Marcus," Betty said warmly, "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. Mrs. Johnson, Marcus struggled with words that had never come easily. "I want to thank you for inviting me. It means more than you know." Rachel appeared behind her father, grinning broadly. "Grandma Betty, is it okay if I call you that? Dad's been practicing his apology speech for a week. Sugar, the only apology needed is from me for not inviting you sooner." Betty ushered them inside, where the warmth of family and food created an atmosphere that wrapped around visitors like a beloved quilt. Tommy looked up from his place cards. "Mr. Henderson, I made you a place right between me and Liberty. She likes you now, you know. She told me." Marcus knelt beside the boy who'd taught him more about courage than 34 years of adult experience. "She told you, did she?" "Not with words," Tommy explained with 8-year-old patience. "With her tail. When you walked in, it wagged 3 times. That means friend who brings good smells." Indeed, Liberty had risen from her position by the fire and was now sitting politely at Marcus's feet, her tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps across the hardwood floor. "May I?" Marcus asked, extending his hand. Liberty sniffed his palm, then gently placed her paw in it, the same greeting she'd offered months ago when Tommy had declared him a friend, but this time Marcus didn't hesitate. He shook her paw with the solemnity of a peace treaty being signed between former enemies. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Rachel was right. You really can tell the difference between good people and bad people, can't you, girl?" As they gathered around the extended table, 4 generations brought together by circumstance and bound by choice, Betty Mae Johnson looked around at faces that had been strangers months ago and were now irreplaceably family. Sarah no longer carrying the crushing weight of single parenthood alone, Tommy chattering excitedly about his new job helping Dr. Walsh with other traumatized animals, Rachel planning her freshman year at Montana State's veterinary program, Marcus tentatively petting Liberty's head while she supervised the dinner preparations. "Before we eat," Betty announced, "I'd like to say grace." Hands joined around the table, creating a circle that included not just the humans, but somehow encompassed the dogs as well. Liberty and her children, all finding their purposes in healing rather than harming. "Dear Lord," Betty began, her voice steady and sure, "thank you for storms that bring strangers together, for second chances that arrive in unexpected packages, and for the reminder that family isn't always the people we're born to. Sometimes it's the people we choose to love. And thank you for dogs who teach us about loyalty," Tommy added solemnly. "For courage that grows stronger when it's shared," Sarah continued. "For forgiveness that heals old wounds," Marcus said quietly. "For hope that never gives up," Rachel finished. "Amen," they said together. As they began passing dishes around the table, Liberty settled at Tommy's feet with a contented sigh. Outside, the Montana sky was clear and cold, but inside Betty Mae Johnson's kitchen, warmth radiated from more than just the fireplace. It came from the knowledge that sometimes when the world seems darkest, salvation arrives in the most unexpected forms, sometimes on four legs, sometimes in a child's innocent faith, sometimes in an old woman's willingness to open her door to strangers seeking shelter from life's storms. The meal that followed would be remembered by everyone present as one of the finest they'd ever shared, seasoned with gratitude and served with generous portions of grace.